This is the story of how id Software went from making 2D sprite games like this to creating a brand new genre of 3D gaming that's still hugely popular today, the FPS. Not only did they do it in just over 2.5 years, they did it in style, with one of the most addictive and best loved titles to this day, DooM. What is fascinating is just how quickly the quality of id's games evolved over such a short space of time. This video is sponsored by the very wonderful people at PCBWay. PCBWay are the leading electronics and prototyping manufacturer. If you've got an idea, you can use PCBWay to turn it into a reality. PCBWay can build PCBs from just $5 and build them for you in around 24 hours. Now, what I really love is that for people that suck at using a soldering iron, like myself, you can upload your PCB file and have PCBWay assemble it all for you. PCBWay also do 3D printing, CNC machining, sheet metal fabrication, injection molding, and so much more. They are widely reputed by us in the retro computing community as being the go-to supplier of your PCB needs. So if you've got an idea for an electronics project, why don't you give PCBWay a try at PCBWay.com? After all, that is the PCB way. We thank PCBWay for sponsoring Al's Geek Lab. Now, let's get back to the video. Meet the rock stars of gaming. id Software was the brainchild of some employees of a company called Soft Disk Publishing. Programmers John Carmack, John Romero, designer Tom Hall, and artists Adrian Carmack and Kevin Cloud. These guys didn't pop out of nowhere, straight to demon-slaying action and million-dollar budgets. They had a humbler beginning. id were originally just a small group of guys from Shreveport, Louisiana. In the beginning, they went by the name IFD, short for Ideas from the Deep. They later changed the name simply to id, an initialism for In Demand. But before then, John Carmack and John Romero were writing games for a company called Soft Disk Publishing, a software magazine, if you will. You'd pay a subscription every month, and in return you'd get a floppy disk that would come loaded with the games that the programmers such as Carmack and Romero would make. Most of the games that Soft Disk and similar companies such as Apogee Software were releasing at the time were under a new software licensing method called shareware. You were actively encouraged to copy the software that you got and share it with your friends. The shareware version of the software would often be a cut-down version, perhaps just a few levels out of the full game, or present a nag screen until you paid full price for the title. This was a completely novel way of distribution at the time. If you looked at the games on the PC in the 1980s and early 1990s, the platformer was the king of the hill. When it came to graphics, the PC wasn't really as sophisticated as the consoles of the time. For starters, most PCs used the 4-colour CGA or the 16-colour EGA standard. What was worse, it was pretty much believed to be impossible to make smooth scrolling graphics, so most games would go from room to room. Rather than scroll the screen in one fluid motion to the next area in the game, you'd just move. This is something subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. For example, here's one of John Romero's titles from 1990, a soft disk title called Dangerous Dave. It's just room-based, there's no side-scrolling. However, some of the team at Soft Disk reckoned that they could get past the idiosyncrasies of the PC's graphics adapters of the day by writing clever code. They reckoned they could do it in style too. These guys were young and knew no limits. On the 20th of September of 1990, John Carmack and Tom Hall had been up all night coding a new game routine. When John Romero stepped into the office in the morning, he was greeted by a floppy disk on his desk saying "Run Me" on its label. However, Carmack and Hall were nowhere to be seen. What Romero saw made him speechless. Not only had the two devs written an impressive clone of Super Mario Bros. 3 for the PC, they had crafted a smooth-scrolling horizontal and vertical marvel using the technology that they called adaptive tile refresh. They essentially made the PC and its EGA display adapter do the impossible. However, instead of using the Mario character, they used their own sprite character, Dangerous Dave, which was readily available in their own artwork library. When John Romero showed a few folks at Softdisk the new game, he expected them to be amazed. But all of them said, "So what?" When Romero finally got to see Tom Hall and John Carmack later that day, he told them that this was their ticket to get out of Softdisk and make games for themselves. So it was on this very same day id Software was born. Quickly, the two Johns got together on the weekends using PCs that they borrowed from Softdisk, who still employed them at this point. They went to work on their first game. So sure of their programming prowess were Romero and Carmack that they polished up Carmack's code, creating replicas of the Mario sprites and textures, and when it was done, they called up Nintendo of America and told them that they had written a clone of Super Mario Bros. 3 for the PC, asking them if they would like to license it for release on the PC. Nintendo said thanks, but no thanks. They only wanted their games to be released on their own hardware. Not to be undone by their letdown from Nintendo, their Mario experiment evolved into Commander Keen. The lovable, helmet-wearing, alien-bashing kid hero was born. But it was just getting started. By April of 1991, they wanted to put players in the driver's seat, literally. Games from now on would be 3D in nature. Welcome to Hovertank 3D. Your mission? Rescue people from a city before a nuclear strike. Sounds serious? Well, for gamers, it was seriously fun. Sure, maybe a touch of motion sickness was to be had from your bobbing hover tank, and yes, the sound was laughable. And the plain EGA graphics were nothing to be marvelled at either, especially those non-existent textures. But yet, there was something about this. This was essentially the beginning of a new genre of computer games, the FPS, or first-person shooter. Although there were games like 3Demon or Battletank going as far back as the early 1980s with wireframe graphics, most people don't consider them FPS games. They certainly didn't have the 3D graphics and rapid gameplay like Hovertank 3D did. Up next from id Software, from tanks they went to catacombs. id Software's next trick was to toss players into dark dungeons with Catacomb 3D. They swapped vehicles for fireballs, because, you know, fireballs are more badass. Released in November of 1991, Catacomb 3D was the next game in the Catacomb franchise, following its 2D predecessor written by John Carmack called Catacomb, as well as Catacomb 2. You can clearly see that quite a lot of work had been done in the mere 7 months between Hovertank 3D and Catacomb 3D. You might think that all that advancement in just 7 months was pretty amazing. However, the team were also working on several other titles in parallel, so it's even more mind-blowing that they were able to achieve all this work in such a short space of time. The enhancements in Catacomb 3D over Hovertank were clear to see and hear. For starters, despite the graphics still being in 16-colour EGA mode, they certainly looked a lot more interesting. Firstly, instead of a gun, there was a 3D view of the player's hand which shot power orbs that would kill the monsters. There were a wide array of textures on the walls compared to Hovertank's simple grey, white or yellow walls. For a bit of trivia, it's believed that John Romero was influenced by the game Ultima Underworld, which was still in development at this time. Apparently, Carmack and Romero had seen a demo of it at CES in 1990, and Underworld's developer Paul Neurath recalls a comment where Carmack cheekily said he could write a faster texture mapper. Bobby Prince had made a soundtrack for Catacomb 3D, unlike the homemade noises of Hovertank. Although a bit repetitive, it definitely added to the gameplay. Those ad-lib sounds were some of the first melodies to come out of people's PCs. Before then, it was pretty much all the screechy PC speaker. The game also featured some firsts, which were seen in later id games, such as blue health potion bottles resembling those of DooM. Furthermore, players' health was indicated by an image of a face, which deteriorates as damage is taken, just like DooM guys. How's this for familiar? Door keys must be picked up to advance through levels, and guess what colours they are? Yep, they're red, yellow and blue. In fact, the pseudo-random number generator, which was found in the DooM source code, can also be found in the source code of Catacomb 3D. In fact, the roots of the function that use fake contrast to accentuate the look of angles in the level's geometry were also found in the source code to Catacomb 3D, which is freely available these days. Catacomb 3D truly was a fundamental game for the development of the genre, both in terms of design and its codebase. But then something even bigger came. Drawing inspiration from their past works, id Software unleashed Wolfenstein 3D, with more mazes, more bad guys, and a ton of Achtung. It was like they turned the intensity knob to 11.
Once we're in enemy territory, we're going to be doing one thing and one thing only. Killing Nazis. Any and every sumbitch we find wearing a Nazi uniform, they're gonna die. Sound good? Yeah!
Notice the pattern? Now in 256 colour VGA, the graphics got slicker, the gameplay deeper. The folks at id were on a roll crafting the DNA of first-person shooters. Instead of taking a mere month or two to create, id were spending more and more development time. Wolfenstein took 6 months to make. Still an incredible achievement if you compare that to the games of today with massive development teams and millions of dollars in budgets. Id were around 6 people with very little budget. They were still pumping out other titles as well though.
They say all work and no play makes Johnny a dull boy. But there are a lucky few who get to play at work and make it pay. In fact, Apple Computer was put on the map by a couple of young men employing just such a strategy. Now a similar story may be unfolding near Dallas. Byron Harris reports.
It's three-dimensional. It's texture map. It's Wolfenstein, one of the hottest-selling computer games in the world, in which B.J. Blazkowicz storms a Nazi bunker in search of Adolf Hitler. The game is the creation of John Romero and 5 other computer whizzes who comprise a company called id Software. Together with another firm called Apogee Software, Romero and his co-workers have parlayed a love of computers and computer games into a multi-million-dollar business. This year, Apogee, which sells software, and id, which creates it, will gross close to $5 million, up from $6,000 2 years ago. This is id Software headquarters. John Romero and partner Jay Wilbur are hard at work, playing games. They consider it research.
When the latest game comes out, that's real cool new technology, we're already way past that because of the research we've been doing during the development of the game.
One of the reasons for Wolfenstein's success is texture mapping, a technique for giving surfaces realistic texture. That quality did not come easily. It is achieved by clever programs which squeeze the most out of a computer's components. Despite the frivolity at id, it's a lot of 16-hour days by programmers, artists, and designers that make the game successful. And the place does have the magic of a successful enterprise. Work and play here are the same thing.
Whilst Wolfenstein was a huge success, and the full version sold for $60 a pop, which made id have some proper cash for the first time, there were certain things about Wolfenstein 3D that didn't make the game as immersive as it could be. For example, look at the textures. There's no roof, just lights hanging from an otherwise boring grey ceiling. Come to think of it, the floor isn't up to much either. Also note that it's all on one level. No baddies at height, no transporters or lifts, and while strafing could be achieved by holding down the Alt key, You couldn't circle strafe or use the mouse. Whilst the sound was digitised, the music could still be a little tedious at times. But the biggest irk of Wolfenstein 3D was that it got a little monotonous after a while. Once you'd gotten over the technical brilliance of the game and the new glitzy 256 colour graphics, the gameplay wasn't good enough to keep me playing all day. It was essentially Catacomb 3D with VGA graphics and Nazis to slay. And then, the doors opened to Doom. Darker, scarier, and way more demonic. This wasn't just a game, it was a cultural phenomenon. From pixelated tanks to demon-slaying marines, id Software's journey was nothing short of epic. The lights would flicker atmospherically, an imp would shriek from afar, a gurgle emanating from some toxic waste ahead, the riff of Bobby Prince's metal soundtrack, and then it was on. You'd strap on your UAC issue Marine's helmet to slay an onslaught of baddies that were not of this earth, hopefully succeeding where the other Marines before you had failed. The very first thing that you'd see in front of you in level 1 was a pool of water that was in a hollow, something that just couldn't be done with the Wolfenstein engine. Turning to the left, aside from a couple of your first enemies, was a stairway that led you to some armour. A stairway that automatically made the game feel immersive in a way that Wolfenstein could not. And then, before you, were windows that you could look out of, and in the distance, a digitised image of green mountains of the landscape of Mars. Not only was this immersive, for 1993, this was pretty much photorealistic graphics. Doom went on to become the benchmark for gaming. It was so significant, people not only shelled out their hard-earned money for the game, they often upgraded their PCs from basic 4MHz XTs or low-end 286s to buy high-end 386s, 486s, or even the new Pentium. Before Doom, lots of people didn't need to use their PC for anything more than simple games or office software. This game changed the landscape of hardware requirements. Not long after Doom was released, you couldn't buy low-end 286s anymore. 4MB RAM was the new minimum, 640K was no longer enough for everyone. Doom also used an innovative type of memory management which had hardly been heard of before, called DPMI, or DOS Protected Mode. From then on, almost all games in DOS used DPMI, and most games started needing 486s or Pentiums. The first-person shooter genre exploded, with games such as Hexen, System Shock, Duke Nukem 3D, Dark Forces, and countless other imitators coming along within the next 2 years. But it was id that kept innovating, the next time with Quake in 1995. id were like a company that never stopped prototyping, but rather than build prototypes and proof of concepts that took serious time, each game that id developed was the prototype. Each game was a huge iteration over the one before, never buggy, and almost always groundbreaking. So, the next time you blast a demon in Doom, remember the path it took to get there. From cheeky Mario clones to the depths of hell, it's all in a day's work for the legends of id Software. Thanks for joining me on this pixel-powered ride down memory lane. If you like this video, why don't you smash the like button like it's a demon, and don't forget to subscribe and set the notification bell to all for more retro computing deep dives. If you really like what I do, please consider joining me over on patreon.com/AlsGeekLab, where you get ad-free videos, early releases, a fantastic community, behind the scenes stuff, and lots of other specials besides. Prices start from just $3 and it really helps me justify working on this channel. Until next time, thanks very much for watching Al's Geek Lab.